One of the fortunate things I get to do in my day-to-day is sit down with young people and teach them about their emotions. Whenever I do these, I have to remind myself that I'm excited, I'm not anxious. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is reflecting on stories of parents, of coaches, and of athletes themselves. And the reason I spend so much time doing that is we need to know where we've come from in order to move into the future to where we want to get to. And so recently I've spent more and more time thinking about my story to position what I do today. And so I grew up in Mount Albert in Auckland and started playing football from the age of 5 right through to this photo you can see here, which is the first 11 football team, Mount Albert Grammar, in 1997. And something really interesting happened in 1997. New Zealand football got awarded the 1999 Under-17 World Cup at North Harbour Stadium. And what they decided to do was to uplift all of the talent all around New Zealand, bring them to Auckland and place them in Kelston Boys, Mount Albert Grammar and Auckland Grammar. And so I was one of the locals and I'd grown up with these guys. We'd gone to primary school together, we lived down the street, we played in the backyard, and we played football. And we went to trainings Tuesday and Thursday nights, and on Saturday we played our game. And in 1997 we got a whole bunch of strangers and they infiltrated the team, and half of my mates ended up on the bench or in the reserves. And it really changed the experience for all of us. Now, it wasn't all negative. There was some really good talent that came with this change that meant that we had something to aspire to, and there was real excitement around what lay in the future for football in New Zealand. But what also came with this talent was a new coach, and a new coach that I simply didn't get along with. For lots of reasons I won't go into tonight. I remember a conversation with my parents at the end of my 6th form year, sitting around the family dinner table, and I said to Mum and Dad, I don't think I can play next year. This relationship I have with the coach is not working. And it was to the detriment of a sport that I loved. So I made the hard decision, Mum and Dad supported it, and I haven't kicked a ball since. So when I reflect on that experience, it really did shape me, and it's not until now that I have appreciated how much. So I left Mount Albert Grammar and I went down to Dunedin to start my study. Halfway through my 7th form, I said to my PE teacher, what should I do? I don't really know. And he said, go to Dunedin, you have a ball. Study anything you want, but PE is pretty fun. And I love sport, lived it, breathed it, went to school to eat my lunch, play sport. So I ended up spending just over 6 years in Dunedin. I did an undergraduate in physical education and an exercise physiology master's. But most importantly, I met this lady here. Does anyone follow netball? So this is Anna. So Anna and I met in 2005 on the side of a netball court when I was running some fitness training, and she was competing for the Otago Rebels. And she told me that I was doing a really crappy job, abused me, as she often did, and now we're married with 3 kids. But the reason I bring Anna up is because I spent 9.5 years in tertiary education, but I learned more from sitting on the couch with Anna through her 20 years playing netball at the highest level and a 3-year break playing beach volleyball on the world tour than I ever have learned sitting in a lecture theatre or studying my PhD. So Anna would come home full of joy sometimes, and other times full of frustration and anger. And we'd sit on the couch and we'd talk about her experience, and she'd share what the coach might have done, what the strength and conditioning coach might have done, what the nutritionist might have said, the relationships that she had with other players, and how some of that conflict was really tricky in her early years to get through. And it gave me perspective that I now take into the work that I do, that I would have never got if I hadn't spent all that time with an athlete. And then in 2010, after spending about 6 years doing strength training and high performance, I started to see that there were athletes coming through the pathway with gaps, physical gaps, mental gaps, emotional gaps. And so I got an itch to do something about it, and I went to see a friend in Auckland here at AUT Millennium, which is our high performance sport facility. We're our best trained, but also where the public can turn up and engage in lots of different programs. And I said to him, I think I want to teach. He said, well, there's nothing for you here right now, but if you want to do a PhD, we've got this scholarship. And the scholarship was to run what was called an LTAD program, long-term athlete development. And the cool thing about it was the first program in New Zealand, and it was actually one of the first programs in the world. And what the program did was it brought young people in between the ages of 8 and 18 and gave them the physical skills that they needed to perform at their best in their sport, to increase performance and also to reduce the risk of injury. At the time it was just a physical program, but the journey that I went on meant that when I handed the reins over at the end of 2019, it was much more than that. We'd developed a psychological component, an emotional component, a component where we spent time with the families, with the parents, helping them to understand the experience and what they could do at home. And that taught me so much about what it means to create environments for healthy development. And so that's really why I'm here tonight, is to talk to you about what I've learned and to try and distill that down into the next 40 minutes. So what we know is that when we think about development, it's really important that the athlete sits at the center of it, but most of those programs are led by the coach. So we have a coach at the helm, they design the environments, and then most importantly we have the support of the parents. And now for a long time working in sport we were told that parents are trouble and we want to push them away, but that's completely the opposite to what I believe now. And the more that we can work with parents, the better the environments are going to be and the better the experience for the athletes. And not only should we be working with them, but they're a crucial cog in the wheel. Our athletes spend more time with you than they will ever spend with us, at least up until this point of their development. And so if we really want to understand how we can help, then we need to understand as a coach how we design our environments, but also what we do when they're not with us, when they're in the car, when they're at home, when they're at school, because all of these things contribute to the athletes and their path in the development space. So I'm going to share with you 3 essential ingredients that I've come to understand when it comes to good support for developing athletes. But first, I'm just going to bring 3 myths to the floor, because it's really important that we create some context around some of the things that get in the way. So myth number 1 is that junior success leads to senior success. And therein lies a paradox in youth sport that I'm going to dig into a little bit. But first I want to introduce you to Charlie. So he's a young motocross rider, and he came to me with his dad because he was starting to get really anxious on his bike. Does anyone know about motocross? Do you know how the sport works? So it's a really interesting sport because most of the time the environment is geared around racing. So what happens is young athletes turn up with their bike and they line up on the start grid and they compete against their mates. And most of the time that they spend in the sport is about competing. And we know that competing usually results in a narrative around winning, because that's what it's for. And it would be naive of us to think that that's not what sport is for, because by default, if we create competitions, we look towards a winner. But what we saw was Charlie getting really anxious on his bike, not really wanting to engage, deciding that he didn't want to show up and do what he had loved for so long. And when I spent time talking with Charlie, what we quickly realised was that everything was geared around performance, because there was a belief that the result and success at the early stage of development meant that that was going to lead to success later on. Now, we need to understand that that wasn't in fact the truth, and rearrange how he showed up in some of these environments. And so this narrative around winning in youth sport over the last 10 years has become more and more entrenched, and I see athletes being paid to achieve certain outcomes, and so we're entrenching this idea of junior success matters. This is something that's become omnipresent in our environments. So whenever we see social media posts around our young athletes, usually it's something to do with the outcome. So teams that kids are making, competitions that are being won, and this is the athletes, and it's us as parents, and it's schools that are sending newsletters out. So if you read between the lines in a school newsletter, you will always see that it's about the outcome, and we know that what we incentivize, our young athletes are much more likely to aim at. And so we have to be really careful of the messages that we're sending. So we've seen this narrative in youth sport that winning is the thing that we're aiming for. But the question, what is it for, is a really important one, because it depends on what we want. And the science is really clear when it comes to development. So this is the paradox. We have to make a decision whether we want to set our kids up to win at the junior level, or whether we want to give them the best opportunity to go on, reach their potential, and win at a higher level as they possibly can. So we know now there was a big review of research done by a lady in the US and by a German researcher, and they looked at lots of different sports, and they looked at everything that had happened in the junior level of competition that led to success at the senior level, and they collated all this data, and then they made some implications based on what they saw. And what the data shows is that 1 in 33 athletes will make it that are successful at the ages of 13 to 14. So the winners to 13 to 14, on average, 1 out of 33 of those athletes will go on to be successful at the senior level. Now that gets a little bit better at the ages of 15 to 16. 3 out of 17 will go on for success. And at the ages of 17 to 18, we have 5 out of 21. So it gets better the more or the older our athletes are, but we've got to be really careful because if we want to organise our environment for success at the junior level, then we do one thing. If we want to organise for success at the senior level, then we do something else. And so what we've come to understand is that winning is one thing, but we need to balance it with how to win. And that's the really important thing. We need to understand where performance comes from if we want to give our kids the best opportunity to go on and succeed at the highest possible level. So the myth number 2 is that more is better at the developmental level. So there's no denying that kids are doing more than they ever have. They're in more teams, they're in more trainings, they're in more structured competitions. Now we know in development that there's this phase that we refer to as the baby giraffe phase. And this is a really sensitive period of development that happens during adolescence. So what is the baby giraffe phase? So there's a period of accelerated growth that happens in early adolescence that has effect at the time and has a residual effect over the next 5 to 10 years. So here on the vertical axis we've got growth rate, and on the horizontal axis we have age. Now, a Canadian researcher went out and got thousands of kids, and they measured a whole bunch of anthropometrics: height, weight, leg length, mass. And then what they did is they created some predictive equations around their biological age and where that happens relative to chronological age. So chronological age from the time we were born until how old we are now. So for me, 42 and a half years. Biological age is the age of my bones and my tendons and my skeleton based on my genes. So what we know in adolescence is that kids change biologically in really important and diverse types of ways. So we know for boys, this blue line here, at about the age of 13 on average, that young men will be growing at the fastest possible rate. So this is when you see the baby giraffe effect. So it starts at the ankle, and the long bones of the leg will start to grow. That will move up the body to the torso and then into the upper body. So this is why we see in young athletes issues with severs at the ankle, Oshkosh-Slatters at the knee, some stress fractures at the back, and it's all got to do with the phase of growth that our athletes are in. For girls, this happens about 1.5 years earlier, about 11.5. Now I know some of your sons and daughters are older than this, but it has residual effects. So we know that it affects selection. So across a number of different sports, we're selecting kids into teams based on their biological age. So we'll see early maturers, they'll have better success in sports like cricket, in sports like football, where it's a very physical game. And that bias will stick around for up to 6 years. But what we also know, more importantly, is that when they go through this growth spurt, their bodies will change, and often they'll regress in skill, and they have to reorganize in order to relearn the skills that they once had. And so it's during this period, which can last up to the ages of 16 and 17, where growth starts to slow down, we need to think about how much we're actually doing. And there's research out of the UK and the English Premier League now that shows that if we know when these growth spurts are happening and we reduce the amount of load, then we can reduce injuries by up to 73%. So this is really important to understand that more is not always better, and a lot of the time we have to consider growth as a fundamental factor in the development of our young athletes. So this is a picture of Alice, who came to us from the Hawke's Bay. So this young athlete was 15 when she came to us, and she'd had issues with stress fractures in her back. So this was a triathlete, and you watch your knee moving here. The knee's not supposed to move in that way, so there's lots of risk for knee pain, but also stress up here at the lower back. And triathlon is a really great sport for load, and so we had a few things that started to collide for this young athlete. So she was at the age where she was growing really quickly, so she was a later maturer, so her growth rate was later than her friends, and she was in programs. She had been identified in a program where the load had suddenly increased. And it's also at the stage where young athletes start to identify with sport as being a really important part of their lives. And so she had this identity that was starting to get constrained around being a triathlete. So we had the perfect storm: growth, more load, and an identity that said to her, triathlon is important to me, and the world around me is telling me that I'm doing okay at it. And that resulted in a stress fracture in her back that she couldn't get rid of. So she came and saw us once we had identified that she was doing too much at a time of really sensitive growth, and we helped her to understand this. She pulled back in intensity. The the pain went away, and in 6 months she was back to training at her full load. So more is not always better when it comes to young athletes. And myth number 3 is that mistakes are bad. So we did some research around sideline comments. Now this looked at both youth coaches but also parents. And what we were really interested in was the type of information that was coming from the sideline. So what we did is we sent researchers out to watch sport from the sideline. Netball, rugby, football, cricket wasn't one of those sports. But we observed what was coming from the sideline, and then we categorised it based on the type of information that was being sent. There was 3 categories of information that we ended up being really interested in. The first one was encouragement. So encouragement is something like, come on Johnny, you can do it, go for it. Now we were expecting that there would be a reasonable amount of encouragement, and that's what we saw. We also saw criticism, but we were expecting some criticism. So it was something along the lines of, Johnny, don't do this, do this. So there was criticism, and we would expect some criticism, and it came in at less than encouragement, but there was still more than we really wanted to see. But the big one was instruction. Now this was the really surprising piece for us, because we saw 3 times as much instruction as we did encouragement and criticism put together. Now, the thing with development is that it's really important to understand learning and how young people get better. And when empowered with that information, we can think about the information that we're providing. Now, as adults, what we do when we're trying to support is we often look back at where we've come from our point of view. And when we do that, the path from A to B becomes much clearer, because we can think about the journey that we took. And when we know the straightest line from A to B, and we want to help our kids get there, the best way to do that is to instruct. But what we know when we're 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years of age is looking from A to B, it's never a straight line. Nor do we want it to be a straight line, because the whole purpose of adolescence and the development stage of sport is to become really good at solving problems. And problems are never solved in a straight line. So when we instruct, essentially it's like creating a straight line from A to B. And what happens is we miss out on the complexity of solving problems, which is in fact how young people learn. And so we have to be really careful with what it is that we're saying from the sideline, in the cars, around the table at home, wherever these types of environments show up. Okay, so what have we learned? Keeping in mind the myths, we have to think about what we can do to counter some of those things. And the first essential is we need to become very good at asking great questions. So I think about this as acting like a scientist. And I think we all need to play roles around being more like scientists, whether that's coaching, parenting, wherever we show up as adults to help young people in their experiences. So one of the things that I see a lot of is athletes that feel like they're getting stuck. So they can get stuck emotionally, they can get stuck physically, they can get stuck tactically, they can get stuck technically. And the way to get through a period of feeling stuck is to be able to come up with different solutions to the problem. And young people can only draw on their experiences to solve those problems. So our job is to create more experiences. And we can do that through asking great questions. The other thing we know is that the noise becomes greater and greater as athletes transition further and further up the pathway. So this was some research out of the UK. Some colleagues over there looked at feedback in rugby and rugby league. Now this was looking at athletes that were transitioning from junior to senior level of sport. So you can think about this as kids aged between 16 and 19 years. That's a really important transition because it's the transition where they're going from junior to senior, and it's also the transition that's most tricky to navigate. So one of the really important pieces of data, now my colleagues sat down with these athletes, they spoke to them about the feedback that they were receiving, the types of things that were being said, and then started to collate all that information to try and find some themes. And there's a couple of things that were really, really curious. The first was that the number of feedback providers increases significantly as kids get older. So here, as kids get 18 plus, they can have 23 different providers of information. So you can imagine that one of the hardest things to do is to figure out who to listen to. So one of the skills, well, there's two things we can think about, is we can ask great questions to try and give our young athletes the skills to navigate this complexity. Really challenging part of development is to know who to listen to. So here's just a couple of clips that were taken directly from the research. So what we found was there was incoherence between coaches in different teams. So the coach underneath the head coach prefers something slightly different to the head coach and was telling me to look at different things. So again, who do I listen to? There was also incoherence between coaches and parents. So the coaches say that I should work on my kicking, and my dad says, they should say shouldn't. I shouldn't be working on my kicking, so that is confusing. So it becomes a challenge around filtering. What was also curious is that they ascertained that kids at this stage of development will tend to listen to the person that holds the most power. And so that becomes confusing. So we need to navigate the space by asking better questions. So this is a learning cycle. It's a really basic learning cycle, but it underpins development in lots of really interesting ways. And so we can do this as coaches and as parents by learning to ask really good questions, because what this does is that it brings to life the experiences of our kids. So this is how all learning happens when it's done well. We have an intention, so we go into a situation having a goal, knowing what it is that we want to work on. Now this is something that athletes will get better at and become more comfortable with if we make it something that turns up in their experience more and more and more. So they have to learn how to do this well, and if we ask the right questions, we can facilitate that process. It hands the learning back to the athlete, cuts through the noise, and really is going to accelerate their learning. Really simple process that we can all use through asking great questions. Okay, essential number 2 is to embrace experimentation. So this is Sam, and Sam was one of my master's students, and he came to me a couple of years ago and said that he was really interested in doing some research in rugby because there were some environments that he was seeing that he didn't think were particularly positive when it came to our developing athletes. And so what he did was he set up an experiment in 1A rugby in Auckland, and we got 5 schools on board, and we took their first 15s, and he went and sat with the athletes. There weren't any coaches in these conversations, and he just asked them about their experiences. He wanted to know their perceptions on the first 15 rugby experience at their respective schools. And what he did is he took all of those conversations, he transcribed them all out, wrote everything else that he heard, and then he started filtering through that research to try and look for specific themes that we could learn from to build better environments for young athletes. Now there were four themes that came to the surface as he sifted through all that information. 2 positive and 2 negative themes. So the 2 positives were the brotherhood. So it was very obvious that the boys loved the brotherhood. And there was lots of opportunity to take autonomy around creating the brotherhood. So a big part of their experience. The second theme was status. So these boys got a lot of status at schools from being a part of the First 15, and that was really a positive aspect. There was 2 negative themes. The first was expectation, that there was a lot of expectation on them as First 15 players at the school, and they really felt that pressure, and oftentimes that pressure showed up in their experiences, and oftentimes they weren't necessarily prepared to handle that pressure. And then the last theme was around control. So this was a quote taken from one of the lads. I was just so focused on not doing anything wrong because I was too scared. I didn't want to get told off for doing something wrong. I wasn't really thinking of what I could do to get better. It's just don't do anything wrong so you don't get told off. So what we found is that those environments allowed plenty of autonomy when it came to off the field, but when it came to on the field, the adults really reined in the control and the boys felt it. Now the interesting piece for us around development, and in particular the adolescent brain, is that really goes against what we know to be important. So when we don't give our young people opportunity to experiment and make mistakes, then it really stifles their learning and their development over time. And so for the young athlete, this part of the brain is going through a renovation. It's changing rapidly, and in order to develop these skills around our thinking brain, logical, sense-making, creativity, it really comes down to learning through making mistakes and giving them an opportunity to do that. Now, one of the other things that we took from the research is that when we don't give them opportunity to experiment and make mistakes, they'll do it anyway. So what we learned was that we should engage in the experimentation to make it better, to make it bigger, and to really give them the opportunity to try and do things to learn to grow. Now what we need at the highest level is resilient, adaptable athletes. The way that we get resilient, adaptable athletes is we have an intention and then we let them go and experiment in their practice, in their games, to figure it out for themselves, to see what's in front of them, to make a decision, to learn from what's in front of them, and then to reflect on that and refine it over time. And in development, that's really our job. So all of the environments need to be set up to be really experimental. Essential number 3, remember why they play. And so I was rung by a mum not that long ago now, and one of the things I get to do is just go and spend time with young athletes and talk to them and try and figure out what's going on in their experience to make it better. And this mum rang me up and she said, Craig, I've got 2 young men and they row, and they're in their rowing 8 at their school, which was a prestigious rowing school in Auckland. And they were about 8 months out from Māori Cup, and she said to me, I'm dead scared that they're going to leave the sport. And she said, oh, can you sit down with them and have a conversation and talk to them, because I'd be gutted if they left the sport that they love. So they started rowing from the moment they could get in a boat, and she'd seen so much joy come from the experience of rowing that she didn't want them to make a decision that they would regret. And she asked me to have a conversation with them to figure out why they were starting to come home from training and say, oh, I'm not sure if I want to go to practice tomorrow. And that's a clear indication that something is not quite right in their experience. And so we met at a local cafe, and over hot chocolate we had conversation, and it wasn't until about 45 minutes into the conversation that for me the penny dropped. And one of the questions I will always ask a young athlete is, why do you play? In this case, why do you row? And the first young man said to me, Craig, it's the banter. So, by the way, like, these guys were competitive, strong, technically, talented young rowers. And this guy just said to me is, I love the banter. And so what he described was turning up in the rowing sheds before they even go out on the water and to banter with his mates. And that was the reason that he rowed. And so it's really easy to forget that there's lots of essential ingredients when it comes to performance, and we have to keep the space for those to flourish. So first, young man said it was the banter. Then it took a little bit longer for his mate it was actually his brother, to really think deeply about why he rowed. And finally we got to this point and we said, it's actually how it feels when me and my mates get in the boat, we go out on the water, it's pancake flat, sun's coming up, we all put the oar in the water together, pull at the same time, and the boat just starts to fly. And he was like, that's why I row. I'm searching for that feeling. And that's why I row. And so when it comes to environments, we have to remember that the reason that they row is not always clear cut. And oftentimes when we're searching for performance, and we're searching for the next skill, and we're searching to see, to get the outcome, then oftentimes we neglect the essential ingredients that actually, one, drew them to the sport in the first place, and two, that they get the most joy out of. So we have to remember why they row. So I just want to finish on the 3 essential ingredients. The first is to ask great questions. So think like a scientist, promote curiosity, understand what your son or daughter's intention is going in, because they will have clarity around that, hopefully. Let them play, and then be really good at questioning for understanding and being reflective on their experiences. Embrace experimentation, so encourage little experiments, encourage them to go out and try things, to get things wrong, to learn and to grow, because they're going to need those skills if they can continue to progress. And always remember why they play. Thanks. This is just my newsletter. If you want to sign up and grab some more information around development, then jump on. It's free. And then I'd invite any questions, comments. Be more than happy to spend some time answering anything that might have been covered in this particular presentation, or anything that might be on your mind around your child's development.